So, without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage, here in Lincoln, Professor Janet. Professor, please take the lead.
Thank you very much indeed for that formulation of why I'm here today. And it's been very nice to be introduced to this lovely university and town. I didn't have to come far, I only came from Derby, so it was, I've been able to have quite a bit of time here. So I must have been in a bit of a grumpy mood when Tim asked me what title do you want? And so I gave this title, and afterwards I almost forgot about it, and so did I really want to speak about that? But I've come round to think, yes, it is an important thing to talk about, which is discrimination and secrets and lies that abound in these disorders. So I hope I'll convince you that these are of relevance. So I'm going to be talking through the changing epidemiology and clinical picture of eating disorders, and talking about the similarities and the contrasts between the different forms of eating disorder. Then I'll be talking about discrimination and secrets and shame, which are very involved in these disorders. The importance of joining up with people with lived experience, and as Tim said, that this has really been very important in my research life and has been one of the sort of blessings of it. And then I'm going to be touching on where we're going now with treatments for anorexia and bulimia. So, first of all, let's look at the changing epidemiology and picture of eating disorders over time. So William Gull was, there he was in about 1876, describing cases of anorexia and having little meetings discussing several cases. And he gave it its name. And you can see his portraits of before and after that he'd given treatment. So these etchings showed the success of his moral treatment, which was having nurses feed the patients in an inpatient ward. And then the next milestone is Gerald Russell, who was my mentor at the Maudsley, and he described an ominous variant of anorexia nervosa, where it took a different form, where people binge ate and had compulsive eating and tried to compensate for the eating by vomiting, etc. And what you can see here is cases coming to primary care and getting diagnosed with an eating disorder. So the blue at the bottom is anorexia. And you can see that's pretty steady over this decade from 88 to 2000. But what you can see is this rising increase in incidence of bulimia nervosa that occurred. And when we look at the next decade, from 99 to 2010, again we've got anorexia nervosa plodding along at a similar level. And we've got then bulimia nervosa flattening out. So we do think that there's increased awareness because it had just been described, Princess Di had it. There are many factors that made the public able to go and say, I think I got this illness. But what you can see here in yellow is a non-specified form of eating disorder. Most of the cases are what we now call binge eating disorder, where people compulsively overeat, but they don't do some of the compensatory behaviours that somebody with bulimia does. So it's always difficult in psychiatry to know the difference. Is it a disorder? Is it a disease? Or is it just a problem, a moral failure, these changes in behaviour we see? So it's not easy for us. But the number of disorders or diseases that we now have been undergoing change. So the American system was started, the last version was in 2018, and we just had the worldwide version last year, where they accept all these newer eating disorders. So binge eating disorder is now there, and we've got all these other disorders which are mainly seen in children. So we've combined the disorders of eating from childhood to the adult life. So avoidant restrictive is a bit like anorexia, but they don't have such a focus on weight as a reason and concern. Pico is where you eat things that aren't food, like you might eat soil, and rumination, regurgitation is where you sort of almost, you posset food and swallow it down. And then there's this rag-bag sort of diagnosis. But you may be aware that the press have a sort of field day in making new diseases, disorders out of eating disorders. So for instance, we've got the bigorexia and the reverse anorexia or muscle dysmorphia. And that's really the presentation that we get often with an eating disorder in males. So it has a slightly different focus than the wanting to be thin. We've got diabulimia or type 1 diabetes. What we find is that people with type 1 diabetes have a threefold increased risk of having a problem with eating disorders. And it takes a different form because what they do is not take their insulin, and so they waste glucose in their urine and lose weight that way. But we've got these other newer disorders, sort of orthorexia, where foods are described as either good or bad, and so people have sort of moral worth attached to foods. And then we have people who don't eat very much, but they drink instead. But none of these are yet accepted, although probably that diabetes will be. What evidence is there of discrimination? Well, the epidemiological studies done in different cohorts of people over time, asking people, community samples, how they conceptualize eating disorders, do tend to say that eating disorders aren't very severe, they're self-inflicted, and they're all under the individual's control. So a moral failure rather than a disorder, a disease. And interestingly, eating disorders, despite them being high prevalence, have not been included when we do these national surveys of mental health. So they've never tried to look at how many are there. So that seems a bit like discrimination. There's also discrimination in terms of research funding and dissemination. So BEAT had a report last year looking into the research funding for eating disorders. And what they noted was that although the burden is 9% of the population, we only get 1% of the mental health research funding. And perhaps associated with this, publications of eating disorders aren't in the highest impact journal. So we only have 0.7% in the top 5 journals with eating disorders, whereas schizophrenia is 20% and depression is 17%. Also, there are a lot of myths about eating disorders. There's a stereotype. So the stereotype is that they're disorders of white, female, high socioeconomic class. But when we look at the evidence, we see something different. And this is a community survey, a very well-organised community survey with a screening phase and then a secondary diagnostic phase in South East London. And what you can see is no cases of anorexia were detected in this sample. which isn't surprising. Cases of anorexia are very rarely detected in surveys. They're not picked up in the screening. Also, they tend to occur earlier onset, more like 16, and this was an adult survey. And of the cases they found, 10%, they were more of the bulimic spectrum type of eating disorder. But only 20% of these had accessed treatment. The others had not gone to get any help. And what you can see in terms of risk factors goes very much against what the stereotype is. So you can see that the higher numbers here, any number over 1, indicates that it's a risk. So belonging to an ethnic minority group, Black or Asian, you've got a higher risk of having an eating disorder. Similarly, it's not just underweight, although being underweight is a risk, but it's being overweight and clinically described as obese. And we do get the gender difference. So there are some things that remain like the stereotype, but not all. And so the Academy of Eating Disorders felt it was so important that people were aware of this current profile of eating disorders, that they had the profile in their list of truths about the disorder. So it wanted to say that eating disorders affect people of all genders, ages, races, ethnicity, body shapes and weights, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. And what tends to happen is that if people have got any of these risks, they all interact with each other. So if you are a minority identity and low socioeconomic group, it interacts and increases the risk. So let's go back to this issue of why people don't come forward for treatment. We all think of them having a problem. Well, anorexia was well noted by a French psychiatrist 150 years ago, more than that, 160 years ago. He said, what these patients characteristically say is, I do not suffer, therefore I'm well. So they don't recognise that they're ill. And we have a fancy name for that, anorexia. It might be that, or it may be because they've got a metabolic anomaly or avoidance. We don't know, but that's characteristic. However, we do see cases of anorexia in our clinic, and that's because it's very easy to make a spot diagnosis of anorexia nervosa, and they look so poorly that they're brought by concerned mothers. But what about binge spectrum conditions? Well, these have had a lot of discrimination and problems throughout their life. We've talked about these interacting minorities, and they often have built up over time weight stigma and shame and blame, and so that they're very wary of coming to medical help, because actually doctors are one of the worst people who have weight stigma and are constantly, what's your weight, what are you going to do about it, etc. They also have their services rationed. They're often talked about not being thin enough for treatment. And so they do suffer a lot of discrimination even on the care pathway. Now, the COVID tsunami has been really interesting and important in terms of showing the effect of an environment on mental disorder. Because we have seen a huge change in eating disorders, and you've probably heard about it with the press. So these are pre-pandemic levels. It was getting slightly increased over time, but what you can see is, on this first year of the pandemic, this very huge rise, and this is electronic records from America and the UK, over 5 million people. And when you look in detail, who is it that is presenting? Females, tending to be young teenagers, 10 to 14, and with maybe anorexia presenting. So this is really interesting, a natural experiment. So what does it tell us about the environment? Well, I commend to you this wonderful patient journey by McKnight, who had anorexia when she was 12 and then qualified as a doctor and then wrote up for the BMJ her illness. And she said, I was recently asked to sum up my experience in one sentence, and I can do it in one word: isolation. And then another patient saying it's the loneliness that will get you, not the hunger or the worrying or the rituals or fear of getting fat. The loneliness is a real killer. And so we can see why lockdown and isolation and cutting off from social ties may have had an influence with this very marked increase in numbers. But of course, there are other risk factors as well. People had a lot more time on the internet, and we know that the internet often has a lot of weight stigmatizing aspects. And also, there was a lot of weight stigma in terms of treatment of COVID. You know, people who were overweight were said to do worse in ITU, etc., and lots of panic about people gaining weight during isolation. So there was lots of blaming and shaming and an increase in weight stigma. And then, of course, lots of anxiety. So these are all the melting pot of possible factors that increased eating disorders. Let's move on, though, because these environmental factors do seem to play a role. But what about other factors, such as genes? And one thing I do want to say is, you know, as Tim said, I'm very interested in working with people with lived experience, either as family members or with their own experience. And it's interesting that they were very interested in looking at the genetics of anorexia, and many private individuals funded research into this area. So we're amongst the group of disorders that have had a very large cohort that has been able to be looked at in the modern ways. So there was something called Charlotte's Helix and the Price Foundation. That hasn't yet been done for bulimia and nervosa, although the EDGI project is in place. And we've had a big surprise for the genetics of anorexia. So something that nobody expected has been discovered, because we've got correlation. We look at the overall risk score. We don't find one single gene tends to be responsible for most psychiatric disorders. It's a mixture of things that tip people over. And what you can see in this slide here is that we've got this positive correlation with the profile of genes seen, particularly in obsessive-compulsive disorder, but in other psychiatric disorders. So there's a common risk factor for a lot of psychiatric disorders. However, the unique thing is this purple area, which is physical aspects. So here we have insulin and fasting insulin levels. We have cholesterol levels, high levels of the high cholesterol, the good cholesterol, whereas low levels of the bad cholesterol. And we've got a negative link to low BMI. So we've it really does seem to be something to do with metabolism as well as psychiatric risk. So a psychosomatic illness. But very interestingly, although eating disorders have been bunched together, these studies are beginning to show, we haven't got all the data yet, but that there are differences across the eating disorder, so quite a lot of diversity. And what you can see in this picture is we've got family genetic risk scores, so family members and what type of illness or what type of phenotype, what type of weight they have. And you can see that the family members around people with anorexia tend to have lower weight, whereas for bulimia, people have higher weight. And what we're getting, we haven't got this edgy data yet, but we're getting evidence that the metabolic picture is totally the opposite for binge spectrum disorders to anorexia nervosa. So the idea that you can have the same treatment for all, transdiagnostic treatment, is probably not exactly right. So what's the take-home message from this? Well, we've seen how many genetic factors, physical and psychological, increase the risk. We've got this profile of anorexia being linked to obsessive-compulsive disorder and anxiety, but this low BMI, low risk of metabolic syndrome type profile, whereas we get the opposite in terms of the metabolic profile, the high BMI, and clinical studies showing higher levels of metabolic syndrome. And we get a different profile of psychiatric comorbidity or ADHD. And perhaps it's not surprising that there's such a diversity in body form, because we have had to adapt to many environments over our evolution. And so having this spectrum of different body types, different ways of handling starvation makes sense. And some, you know, if you need to be running and finding food, you might be better to be lean. And if you're facing a lot of famines, it might be sensible to store up food when there's plenty, etc. So we think that might be the background. What about maintaining factors? Now, these disorders are often last for many years. I talked about you know, that patient journey. On average, anorexia lasts about 7 years, and bulimia and binge eating are similarly duration. So they're not short, self-limiting disorders. So things that keep them going probably play a huge role. And what we know from common sense, but also from our scanning, is that the brain suffers. Now, the brain is one of the hungriest organs in the body, aside from the liver. It needs a lot of energy to function normally. And so if you're not giving it that energy, brain function will reduce. And what is most of our brain function as us as human beings? It's social cooperation. That's the thing that has allowed us to adapt and rule in terms of the animal kingdom. And so what we do see is that that aspect of brain cognition is reduced, and that would lead to this isolation that was so poignantly picked up. What we see is that we do get a reduction in brain structure very quickly in the cortex and the hippocampus. For instance, the cortex is shrunk by 6%, dementia it's 12%, schizophrenia it's only 2%. So it's shrunk a lot in anorexia nervosa, but it does recover with weight gain. So it's very much a problem of the starvation. And what we find is that the growth factors of the brain are reduced. But this has big implications for us in terms of care. So thinking about how does it impact social cognition, which is what our brains are designed to do if the brain's not working in that way. And for us in psychiatry, we have to consider people's capacity to make treatment decisions. And if their brain is on this low power, they perhaps aren't able to make decisions. And we perhaps need to involve supporters more for longer than we would do because of this reduction in brain function. Just some examples of the way that people with eating disorder note that their interactions are reduced. So, these are just some quotes. I find it impossible to communicate fully and truthfully as I'm scared about giving away my coping mechanisms. I have to keep some of it back in case I need it. It's the complete opposite of what any sufferer needs to do. Anorexia thrives on secrets. Another quote from somebody else. The thing about this illness, one of the crazy things, is it turns you into a deceitful little manipulating lying so-and-so. But the bonkers thing about it is that it makes you think you're much better at lying and deceiving than you are. And the only person you're deceiving is yourself. So they get caught into this trap of the illness. And a paranoid attitude about other people develops. Over-analysing what other people are saying, are the hidden motives, always playing back conversations in case they've said the wrong thing or the deeper meanings, and thinking that others are lying to them and trying to trick or manipulate. So you can see how isolation would easily follow from these sorts of thinking styles. So, what about treatment? Well, so far treatments have not been brilliant. Only, as I say, the illness lasts on average about 7 years, and some people have it for life. And the mortality from the illness is high. So we only get about 60% recovery after 10 years. So not very brilliant. I think one of the things you can see from what I've found in terms of, or presented to you, in terms of risk factors of the environment and the brain, is that probably involving and informing supporters is going to be very important. And this is linking with people with lived experience are particularly helpful for that. And what we find is useful is that people with this experience are able to help buffer the loneliness and give emotional support. And also, we can share with supporters some of the special skills you need to convince people to change when they really don't want to change, because it's valued. And so, as Tim said, I've spent a lot of time working with people with lived experience, either family members or individuals with an eating disorder, and developing treatments with them and informing them about the steps that are needed. So these are just an illustration, and some of the supporters, family members, have set up websites and worked really hard to disseminate this knowledge. So why are eating disorders valued? And why is there such a resistance and ambivalence about change. Normally, people want to go to the doctors and say, help me. But this doesn't happen. They're saying the opposite. Well, I think this illustration by another patient with an eating disorder is very helpful. I should have said that a lot of my images are by Elizabeth Kett. This one isn't by her. I think these lived experience images are really helpful to show the disorder. And what you can see in this picture is that she's got this big blob of fear about people, others' life. And there's her anorexia as a little prop that's keeping her protected from this blob of fear. So she's feeling safe, but she's trapped. So this is often why anorexia is valued. So there have been new developments in treatments to overcome the fears. So exposure treatments are what we use to try and help people get over anxiety and fears. And the fears about food may be associated with trauma memories. They may have had sickness, something like that, or something unpleasant happening. Or it could be secondary aspects, sort of the link with weight, stigma, etc. And new technologies are really helping us find new ways of tackling this. So one way is imaginal experience, where people think that they're gaining weight and what would happen if they gain weight. And the sort of things they think will happen is that they will be rejected by others, and that they'd be judged as failing by others. So those are the type of things they often talk about. And one thing that's quite difficult is, in real life, is to have somebody gaining weight over time. So it has to be this imagination, unless you're using other technology. And the sort of technology that has started, and I've seen some interesting work here in Lincoln today, is using virtual reality to have a virtual kitchen and seeing whether we can have either an avatar or a pet to give support. So that's an assessment that's happening at the moment. Another treatment that we're developing is taken from schizophrenia research, where people develop an avatar such as this. They construct a face and a voice of their inner voice that talks back to them, and then the therapist will encourage them to have a dialogue with this avatar, who will be the therapist in a different room talking to them as the eating disorder voice, and they have to talk back to it. So various things. These are just newly developing treatments, but they have a lot of potential, I think. And then there's one which has been developed by the Barcelona group, where they give people exposure to increasing body weight and see whether there's some change in eating symptoms. And they do find that this does produce improvements. So, and of course, this resonates with what the virtual reality is doing in Lincoln. Also, we're trying to look at comorbidities. Most psychiatric disorders are comorbid with something else, and eating disorders are no exception. One comorbidity is treatment-resistant depression. Another is autistic spectrum disorders, particularly for anorexia nervosa. And this is my colleague Ulrike Schmidt, who has done a small study using a treatment for treatment-resistant depression, which is a TMS, magnetic stimulation over the dorsolateral was able to do real stimulation of the brain here and sham, and looked at people over time. So this is a technique used for treatment-resistant depression. And these are the results at 4 months. And you can see, in terms of weight, no change really between the two groups. But depression was reduced more, which we'd expect, because it is a treatment for depression. So we're getting some of the expected changes. At 18 months, this is a bit complicated, because those who had the sham were offered the treatment. And what we're seeing here is the possibility that it's not a very big difference, but there's a possibility that those given this treatment did have an improvement in BMI. The change in depression didn't differ at this time. And so I know some of you may have heard Professor Nutt's talk discussing some of the newer treatments for treatment-resistant depression, such as psychedelics. And there's great interest in using these for eating disorders where we have depression which doesn't respond to any other treatment. So these are studies in progress or planning that are taking place. Oh. Then there's the comorbidity with autistic spectrum disorders, and this is my other colleague, Kate Chanchuria, who's taken a special interest in this. And we do know that the number of people who also have autistic spectrum disorders, it varies. So you get a range from 4 to about 50%, which is a huge range. Probably that difference is because it varies with the stage, if you're looking at adolescents, or if you're looking at those who've got a severe enduring. People who've got these traits tend to have a longer illness, so you see more of them in the severe enduring. But also it might be differences in the diagnostic measures. But she's developed a pathway of supporting people with this comorbidity to tailor the treatment specifically to them. And then finally, let's move to bulimia nervosa, the lack of control over eating, and what new treatments have been developed for this problem. So how can we change these habits? And there's lots of neurobiological models with various brain-based treatments linked to them. So we know that stress or emotional regulation problems, emotional eating is one component of risk for bulimia nervosa. We know that the cognitive style, how flexible or focusing on detail people are. We know that certain foods, junk foods, seem to lead to food addiction that might lead to loss of control. And just showing a very simple treatment addition to the psychological treatments that produce less than 50% recovery is this little app developed by some of my colleagues from Exeter University, and it's just a simple choosing which foods you don't want to eat and choosing which foods you are happy to eat. So if it's green, you press on it. If it's red, you don't press. So a simple little thing. And this has been tested for several years now, first of all in community samples, people overweight, and then in clinical populations, people with bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder. In non-clinical populations, people wanting to lose weight, they did find that they reduced the intake and liking of the foods that were regarded as binge, and it reduced body fat and weight. And we also found similar effects in the clinical populations. in binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa. We had a reduction in the eating disorder psychopathology, and there was less liking for these foods that you had to not press for. So this might be something that can augment our treatment for these conditions and might be helpful early on. And also virtual reality, where people are exposed to food and learn how to moderate some of their compensatory strategies, have also been used and have been found to augment the effects of standard CBT treatment. So this again is the group from Barcelona who've been extremely active in this area. So I've talked a great deal about discrimination, secrets and lies. I've talked about how there's been this change in the prevalence of eating disorders, particularly from 1980 onwards, but even more so after COVID. And discussed how and why these problems are often overlooked and underfunded, and discussed how shame and blame and disgust are features that make coming forward for treatment and having treatment given to you very difficult. People with lived experience themselves, particularly carers, have been extremely helpful in planning and thinking about where research needs to go. So early on they wanted us to do these genetic studies, and they were right, in that we're finding these very interesting genetic differences, which really explain some of the symptoms of the disorder. The secondary effect of impaired brain function increases isolation and increases hopelessness. And this is a major problem that at the moment we have great difficulty in overcoming. We need to work more, but we've got these newer augmentation treatments that might help, such as these exposure treatments, and some of the training treatments that might be helpful. So I'm happy to answer any questions about this important subject. Thank you.